feel clumsy in my body most days. I trip over things, I run into walls. For me, biking is a way to remove myself from my body. It's kind of like how you can give a stutterer a song to sing. They can sing it clearly without stuttering. In many ways, I think it's the same with me. I started biking back when I was in college. I'm not in college anymore. I'm actually kind of at that age in between college and adulthood where nights like tonight, Friday nights, start to lose some of that inexplicable excitement that they used to hold. Back then, biking was essentially a way for me to run away from emotions I had. It was right when I first started dating people and I sometimes didn't know quite how to react. I found that biking, especially on nights like this where the air was warm and felt like there was a kind of built-in tension, like these were the nights that I would ride on. I remember the night my first girlfriend and I broke up. I took my bike out and I took my camera with me and I shot these photos while I was riding, fast, in the dark. They turned out just to be these giant, jagged, blurred splotches of light. But I like biking now, especially at night. 30 miles an hour is an amazing feeling, and there's only 2 inches between your feet and the road. When you get in a rhythm, you can push the bike back and forth with your arms. That rocking, it's that rhythm, that innate knowledge of every bump in the road, every tilt. It's just a feeling you don't really get in cars. This is a long delayed start to the second season of shows. There's a good reason for that. Rejection. Failure. I'd been working on a series of pieces for the second season and an unusual number of them fell flat in the making. I was working on this piece about birds and how they locate on the planet using the magnetic fields intimately tied into quantum mechanics. And unfortunately, the researcher who I was going to talk to took a long vacation out of town. I was working on another piece. It was about this green laser beam that shoots into the sky. And no one knows what it's for, they just know where it comes from, and it comes from this trailer on the very, very east edge of Boulder with barbed wire fence all around it. I went out to where it was, and each night I went out, it wasn't on, so I've never seen it still. And then, thinking back to a year ago, when I released that first episode of Here Be Monsters about prisoner cinema, I wanted to recreate that experiment in my room. So I locked myself in my bedroom closet for 24 hours, listening to white noise in complete darkness. And I only hallucinated one thing. But I started thinking about persistence and frustration and rejection. And it reminded me of the most important day of my 18th year. The story of, well, why I'm riding my bike tonight. It's because of the air. It's an air that's impregnated with potential energy. That kind of tension that makes you know that something's about to happen. I'm going to bike until I get to a part of town I've never seen before. Then I'm going to tell this story. Here Be Monsters, the podcast about 12 different metal bands. The podcast about
the unknown.
I found a parking garage I'd never seen before. Parking garages are one of the few spaces in any city that's open 24 hours a day, so I've always found a strange affinity for them. So the story I want to tell you takes place when I was 18, living in eastern Washington on the side of the state that is exactly not what you think of when you think of Washington State. It's the side of the state that has wheat fields and barley fields and split pea fields. It's a sort of town where there's nothing to do past 10 p.m. But during that summer, when I was 18, just fresh out of high school, in that stage before you know who's going to go to Yale and who's going to be working in the same burger joint. It was back before we segregated, and it was during a summer when I, being kind of the shithead that I was as a teenager, decided to start going to bed an hour later every night. What was once a midnight bedtime turned into a 1 a.m., turned into 2 a.m., turned into 3 a.m., until I was fully nocturnal, sleeping from 10 a.m. until 6 p.m. when I would wake up and eat a full dinner and then head out to my friends and work the only job I could find that summer, which was painting an apartment complex, the inside of it, painting it bright, glossy white. And as I went to work, I would take this little self-powered radio, this little wind-up radio, and I would listen as I painted walls white for hours on end in the pitch black to a show called Coast to Coast AM. It's about aliens and ghosts and conspiracy theorists, the Illuminati, and everything supernatural and unusual. Back then I loved that show. And it would keep me company until 8 a.m. rolled around and I would hop back on my bike and go back to my house and eat a big breakfast and then fall asleep. And as my dad headed off to work and I headed off to bed, he would give me kind of a look like, "You're not going to get away with this forever, punk." This story isn't about that so much. This story is about a night when, before I headed off to work, one of my friends called me and they said, "Jeff, what are we doing tonight? We're dressed like the 80s and we have nowhere to go." The thing you have to understand about my hometown is that there's only 2 places in that town that are open 24 hours a day. One of them is a grocery store where you can buy a dozen donuts after 6 p.m. for $2. And the other one is right across the street, which is this glass fishbowl of a laundromat where instead of fake plastic plants and an oxygenator, there's row after row of front-load washing machines and top-load dryers and top-load washing machines and front-load dryers, and there's these plastic picnic tables that the college students use as their desks as they wait for their laundry to dry, and there's these shopping carts that you're supposed to put your
clothes in, and there's these fluorescent overhead tube lights that just give the whole place a greenish, yellowish glow, and it's just right on the only main drag through my hometown. And so naturally I said, I'll meet you at the laundromat in 15 minutes. And when I showed up, they were already there, and there, along with them, were 5 locals trying to do their laundry at 10 in the evening. And we asked them, we said, hey, how would you feel if we played a little bit of music through this combination tape and CD player? They ignored us or shrugged in approval. And so what started as 5 people turned into a dozen, and before long, a small army of people dressed like it was the 80s, or they were dressed in a way that they thought people dressed in the 80s based off of the magazines and movies and posters that we had seen growing up. And there's this thing you do in your hometown if it's a small one. If you have nothing to do, you drive in a car through the main drags of a city until you see someone you know and you see what they're doing, and if what they're doing is more interesting than what you're doing, you go and do whatever that is, and it's almost guaranteed that whatever they were doing was more interesting than driving around. Before long, someone poked their head through the door. It was a blonde head, short hair. It was a well-recognized face. It was the town's troublemaker. You know, every small town has one, the sort of person that you see being talked to, the sort of person that just draws attention from the police, or the sort of person that seems like they would pay rent in the vice principal's office based on how much time they spent there. In my hometown, his name was Ryan. He was the sort of person diagnosed as ADHD, or maybe neurotic, or maybe disturbed, but growing up we all just knew that he was an eccentric, and he always was that way and still is. And he said, "What are you guys doing?" And we said, "We're having an 80s dance party." And he said, "Hold on for just a minute." And the thing you have to understand about Ryan is that Ryan at any given time was a member of about 12 different metal bands, and 5 minutes later he showed back up dragging a black box about the size of one of us. And he said, "Do you guys know what this is?" And no one said anything. And he said, "This is a 15-watt bass amp." The kind, pleasant dance party that we had been having in our hometown in a fishbowl on the main drag through town suddenly became that kind of loud that you feel in your body, reverberating in your chest cavity, that kind of powerful bass that you only hear at live music shows. It was the kind of loud where you could see the glass panes trembling in their settings, and it was the kind of loud where the only thing you could do was jump up and down, and it was Daft Punk. I had never heard electronic music before in my life. And I said to someone, "What is this?" And they said, "It's Daft Punk." And I said, "What's that?" And they said, "It's this." We were playing percussion on the tops of the washing machines, slamming the lids up and down. We were jumping on the plastic picnic tables that college students used as their desks, with the weight of 3 teenagers at a time bowing the plastic down and springing it back like a bow. Someone was wearing a band uniform, someone else was wearing a necklace, someone was wearing a bright pink cardigan, someone else was wearing her high school swimming team hoodie. The teenager dressed as a drum major directed us around into circles, and people rode in the tiny shopping carts meant for clothing. You know, people critique electronic music for being simplistic, some kind of bastardization of true music, true inspiration, for its simplicity and appeal to mass culture. But strangely, the only 3 words of the song we were listening to were so ironically unapplicable to us. White, middle-class teenagers in a small town the month before we would either go to college or continue working at the burger joint down the road. And we danced for hours. And the warm air was still warm when I went outside, and the muffled sounds coming from inside were audible from more than a block away as I took a picture of people through the glass as they spun around in circles and jumped on the tables more. The air was still impregnated with that same tension, that same potential energy that you have when you have a ball sitting at the top of a ramp needing just a push to go over the top. Sometimes I would lament my parents for raising me in a small town where there was no art scene, there was no culture, where we had wheat fields and a river and the reservoir and things like that, but we had no society. It was a month after this night in August when I went off to college for the first time. It was a month after that that I signed up for my college's radio station, and it was 6 months after that that I started my first electronic music show based off of the music of Daft Punk, and 6 months after that I started volunteering on that station's news team, and a year after that someone pushed me to apply to become the news director of that station, and I did, and I got the job. And it was a year after that that I changed my major from photography to focus it on audio documentaries. And it was a year after that that I graduated and decided on a whim to come produce audio pieces in Boulder, Colorado. And it was 6 months after that that I got a grant through SoundCloud to start this funny experiment in sound called Here Be Monsters. And it was 6 months after that that I received a grant to come back to Washington to continue telling stories to strangers about how I wound up changing my life because of a silly night in my hometown, jumping on plastic picnic tables, listening to Daft Punk. There are some advantages to growing up in a small town where everyone knows who you are, because in a small town on that night where the air was impregnated with that strange potential for nuance and surrealism, that as we moved through that music, a cop drove by, maybe 2, and that cop with his or her hand on that switch for that light bar looked inside that glass fishbowl of a laundromat and saw in there their niece or their nephew or their neighbor or a family friend, and decided to just keep on driving by. Let those kids have their fun. You can only be 18 once. You know, a year ago when I moved to Boulder, I almost lost vision in my left eye. I had a blind patch that was growing, and if you remember the very first episode of Here Be Monsters, you'll remember me standing in a World War II era bunker, seeing things in the dark through my blind spot, where the lasers had cauterized some veins in my eye that were misbehaving, and it's forever since then been my connection with the surreal and unreal and unknown, because I see things out of that eye. But when I first moved to Boulder, I almost had to stop biking at night because that blind patch, that hole in my vision, would make me see things that weren't there. It would make me see squirrels running across the road in front of me, or I would miss potholes that were there, and it almost ruined the night biking experience for me. And I was very lucky that since then my vision's returned almost fully. I've been able to continue riding. I guess what this episode is about, though, is a persistence and learning how to bang your head against a wall and in ways that are productive, because it turns out that most of the time things that we try, just like the 3 stories that I wanted to start this season off with, it turns out that oftentimes things don't work out. And I'm not immune from that, and nor is the show.
So far, we've tackled some pretty heavy topics on the show, and I've been humbled by the kind and thoughtful responses from those of you who have taken the time to write in, or comment, or share the show with your friends. Season 1 was a huge success, and now, with this launch of Season 2, we'll be tackling a whole new set of fears and topics relating to the unknown. I'm currently working on producing episodes about faith and bad astronomy and birth and how to survive when your car breaks down in the middle of Texas. And that's all stuff that you can look forward to in the coming weeks. Don't forget that the whole back catalog of shows is up and available on the website for download. That's hbmpodcast.com. Additionally, a little bit of news came down the pipe this week. It's actually pretty exciting. I'm really proud to say that Here Be Monsters has been scooped up by the Mule Radio Syndicate. The Mule Radio Syndicate is this group that promotes some other great podcasts, including our good friends over at Everything Sounds and Decode DC. So check out muleradio.net for a whole list of other shows that are great to listen to. Joining Mule means that more people are going to be able to hear the show, and that's great. It will also mean that it will be easier to hear on mobile platforms, and it also might mean that I will actually be able to start paying the other producers decent wages. Of course, Here Be Monsters still always needs your help, so if you've got 2 minutes, write Here Be Monsters a review on iTunes, or even better, just think of a friend who likes talking about the world and make a note to mention the show to them. Anyways, the music you heard on the show today came from The Black Spot and Nym. That's NYM. He is awesome. Look him up. Alright, it's getting late out, so I think I'd better bike home. As always, thanks for listening. More episodes soon.